Hello, in Chapter 1 we're going to take a look at the basics of the study of child development. So as we work through the chapters, going through the different age groups, you'll notice that we're focused on physical development, which is what is depicted in this Venn diagram as biological processes. We're going to look at cognition, and the second one to the left is cognitive processes, and then we'll look at social emotional processes, which is on the right, the bottom right. So those are three different domains of development that we'll be looking at. So there'll be 3 chapters for each age group, and we're going to look at age groups in just a minute. But you'll notice in this Venn diagram that these processes overlap. And so that's something to keep in mind. Even though we're looking at each of these separately, they affect each other. And so here you see at the bottom of the slide those same processes we just talked about. And then you see the periods of development. We're going to start out looking at prenatal development, or actually we already started doing that in the way our calendar is organized. Then we're looking at infancy and toddlers, then early childhood, and then middle childhood or elementary school age children, and then adolescence. And so we're going to look at the domains of development in those different periods of development. And so as an overview, philosophically, all throughout history, human beings have had different philosophical views of children. And philosophical, even though philosophy sets the basis for science, the views we're going to talk about here are really just different perspectives, that opinions that may have been argued in a particular way but don't have scientific research behind them. The oldest one is the original sin perspective, which really has a religious basis, and it comes from the Jewish religion, from the Islamic religion, and from the Christian religion. And these all are, this original sin is based on the story that appears in the religious books for all 3 of those religions. And it's a story about Adam and Eve, who lived in the Garden of Eden. And while they were living in the Garden of Eden, they could do anything they want as long as they didn't eat a particular fruit from a specific tree. And unfortunately, they didn't follow that requirement. And so they were banned from the Garden of Eden, and their lives changed dramatically. And from that point of view, all the rest of us are held accountable for that original sin. And whenever given a choice, if we're not closely monitored from this perspective, we're going to make the inappropriate choice. So from this perspective, then children will choose the social and moral inappropriate action unless we're right there looking over their shoulder. And those that have this perspective tend to focus in their parenting on the inappropriate things that children do and deal with that with punishment. And in our second developmental group of chapters, we're going to be talking about another approach that's much more effective and has more positive effects on relationship. The second point of view is almost the opposite of original sin, and this comes from a French philosopher in the 1700s who said that rather than choosing the inappropriate action, the problem is that we're getting in the way, and if we would just leave children alone and let them be free, they're going to automatically choose the appropriate action. and he calls this innate goodness. And then there's another perspective. John Locke, from around the same time as Rousseau, said, no, they're not born bad or born good, as those other two perspectives say, but they're blank. They're a blank slate, and they're shaped by the environment and how that environment and the people in it interact with them. So, three different philosophical views of children. So, another issue in child development, or an issue in child development related to those philosophical views, is the nature and nurture issue. And this involves a debate about whether development is primarily influenced by nature, and nature refers to an organism's biological inheritance, or what comes in their genes, and or if it's nurture, and nurture refers to the environmental experiences like John Locke talked about. So this is an old argument or debate, and so today, since we've been studying child development for over 100 years, almost no one today argues that development can be explained by nature alone or by nurture alone. And really, it's a combination of the two. But when we talk about scientific theories, we'll talk about theorists that believe that even though they might state that one is more important, they still agree that both impact development. So nature proponents claim biological inheritance is the most important influence on development, although they still believe the environment or nurture has an impact. And the nurture proponents claim environmental experiences are most important, even though they may agree that biology or nature has an effect. Okay, so we looked at the philosophical views, and then we looked at an issue in development, nature and nurture. Another issue is development continuous or is it discontinuous? So the continuity and the discontinuity issue. So this focuses on the extent to which development involves gradual cumulative changes, and that's the continuous, or distinct stages, and that's the discontinuous. And these stages are like steps. So from the continuous or continuity perspective, it would be a gradual increase from conception all the way up till maturity. And it's a smooth progression, whereas discontinuity is like a set of stairs. And each stair is qualitatively different. So developmentalists who emphasize nurture usually describe development as gradual and continuous process, like the seedling's growth into an oak tree. And we're going to look at a picture of that in just a minute. Developmentalists who emphasize nature describe development as a series of distinct stages, like the change from a caterpillar to a butterfly. It's the same individual, but they're qualitatively different. So here's a picture of those two concepts. So the top one is continuity, and you can see the acorn, and then the seedling, and then as the tree matures, it just gets bigger. Whereas on the bottom with the discontinuous, you can see the caterpillar, which is the larval stage of that living organism, and then the butterfly, which is the same individual, but they're qualitatively different. One crawls along the ground only, and the other has wings and flies. So continuity and discontinuity in development. So let's look at some definitions. So development is a relatively permanent change in behavior, thinking, or emotions over time. Developmental theories it's a set of rules or statements that describe development, explain development, and predict various aspects of development. So then, how do we find out about development, go beyond those philosophical views? Well, we conduct research. Scientific research is objective, so it's not just a personal opinion of someone. It's systematically, so it follows a set of rules, agreed upon rules, and it's testable. There is the ability to prove. It reduces the likelihood that information would be based on personal beliefs, opinions, and feelings. So child development researchers do use the scientific method, which includes the following steps. First, you have to become an expert in the field, and you need to know whatever's been scientifically proven in the field up until this point. And then the scientist decides what we need to find out, and what problem needs to be studied, and that's where they'll focus their research. They develop a hypothesis of how and why they think this happens, and then they collect research information and data to prove their hypothesis. They analyze that data, and then they draw conclusions for that. Sometimes it will prove their hypothesis, sometimes it won't. If it doesn't prove their hypothesis, then they develop a new hypothesis and try again. Even if it does prove their hypothesis, they need to try it again to see if it proves their hypothesis more than once. And then even if it does more than once, others test their research and see if they come up with the same answers before it becomes a theory. So theories of child development. Theorizing is part of the scientific study of children's development, and theories guide the conceptualization of a process or problem to be studied. A theory itself is an interrelated, understandable set of ideas that helps to explain a certain situation or aspect of development and to make predictions about what's going to happen. A hypothesis is a specific testable assumption or prediction, often written as an if and then. So we would say something like, if we were creating a hypothesis, if a child is fed consistently healthy food, then they're going to grow in height and weight a certain amount. And that would be an example of a hypothesis. So as we study child development, we can use different methods. Some are observational methods, so we might use naturalistic observations where a researcher observes the child in the child's natural environment, and ideally, if they could do that in a way where the child doesn't know they're being studied, that can make a big difference. They could do structured observations where the researcher puts the child in a controlled situation designed to bring about some type of behavior, and then they record the behavior. For example, attachment is an important social emotional concept or aspect of development, and a situation called a strange situation was set up where a child was placed in a room, arrived with their mother, and then the mother left, and then a stranger came in, and they observed how the child reacted when the stranger left and their mother came back. That's a structured observation. There are also ethnographic methods, and these methods seek to understand the child within the child's cultural group, particularly within non-Western cultures. Okay, so those are types of observational methods. We can also use self-report methods where we ask questions, use questionnaires, and then the individual could answer the questions themselves, or we might do structured interviews. The disadvantage for that approach is sometimes the subject might answer the questions the way they think the researcher wants them to answer the question, rather than what they truly feel or answering it accurately. And so sometimes we have to organize those questions in a way to counteract that, like switching up the way the question is being asked. There are also standardized tests, and these standardized tests are tests that are given to an original group of individuals, and then the scores or the averages of development are established, or the norms of that original group are used as a basis for any future individuals that take those tests. Those tests have to be reliable. In other words, they need to prove that there's not going to be a difference in the score if a person takes it now and 2 weeks later. Of course, there's a little bit of error, so that's called a standard deviation, and it's established an acceptable amount. And then validity talks about whether the test measures what it says it measures. Sometimes when tests are given, what's happening is they're measuring something that they're not intended to measure. For example, if a child is given a test that asks questions that are not related to, for example, the area where that child lives and that child's experience, that test is not going to be valid for that child if it's asking questions about things that are not in the realm of that child's experience. So a bit more about standardized tests. There are a uniform set of procedures for administration. So a certain way the test is given, everybody has a certain amount of time. They answer the questions in the same format and using the same answer sheet, and that's uniform procedures. Many standardized tests allow a person's performance to be compared with the performance of other individuals, and that's what we mentioned before, an original group that took the test. Standardized tests have 3 key weaknesses, and that's why we don't want to just depend on standardized tests to make decisions. First, they do not always predict behavior in non-test situations. So some individuals may understand a concept very well, but they're not good at taking tests. And so that test really doesn't predict what they know or really tell us what the individual knows. Second, the standardized tests are based on the belief that a person's behavior is consistent and stable. In other words, they're going to know this or understand it if we were to ask them the question in a different way. And a third weakness of a standardized test is that many psychological tests developed in Western cultures might not be appropriate in other cultures. Okay, so case studies are another way that we can gather research, and these focus on stories of individuals, and many times these stories can be focused on successful historical figures, but it can also be focused on other individuals. There are also correlational studies, and correlational studies look at several factors and try to determine if those factors are related to each other. And something to keep in mind about correlational studies, they don't prove cause and effect. They just show changes in relationship to each other. And they might have a positive correlation, which just means that both of those conditions change together, or they may have, and the positive would be increasing, or they might have a negative correlation, which means that they decrease. You can also do multiple regressions, which in this case you use not just two variables, but you'll have multiple dependent and independent variables. Independent variables are the ones that would change, and dependent variable is the one that may be affected by that change. And then we have experimental designs. And here you can see in this picture we have a researcher that's watching an adult interact with children through a window where the children in the classroom and the adult can't see that anyone's watching them. They might be doing a laboratory experiment, or they might just be doing an observation. We could also do field experiments, so doing things like an elementary school classroom, like we do with peer status, that we'll talk about in the middle childhood or elementary school chapters. And we also might do intervention studies, where we're trying to develop maybe some sort of technique to improve children's ability to problem solve, for example, more effectively. That would be an intervention study. We did mention independent and dependent variables just a minute ago with multiple regressions, so let's talk a bit more about what those are. So an independent variable is a manipulated, influential, and experimental factor. So this is something that we're changing, that we're trying to control. It's a potential cause. It can be manipulated independently of other factors to determine its effect. The dependent variable is a factor that can change in an experiment in response to changes in the independent variable. So researchers measure the dependent variable for any resulting effect caused by the independent variable. And something you have to keep in mind about experiments is you want to make sure that you control any other factors that might influence the effect of that independent variable. And so that's why you might want to do that in a laboratory, because it's much easier to control outside factors and have it be less likely that they're going to change the impact of the independent variable on the dependent variable. Okay, so those are different ways that you can gather your data or information that you're using to prove your hypothesis. There are also different research designs that we could utilize. We could do a longitudinal study where we follow the development of the same children as they get older, and grow and develop over a long period of time. Or the longitudinal study, some of the disadvantages are that you lose participants, it's very expensive to carry out, and it's really hard to tease out those variables. With a cross-sectional study, what you do is instead of doing a longitudinal study, you study different children at different ages. So you look at them as infants and toddlers, one group, and then you look at a group of preschoolers, and then a group of elementary school children, and you put those all together and use that data rather than following the same children over their lifetime. And then there are also long-term intervention studies where you're implementing, for example, that problem-solving approach that we mentioned earlier would be something you could study the effects long-term of maybe that skill the children develop from that method. So those are different ways you can design your research. Okay, so then along with all of that, then the research, there are some ethical guidelines that we have to follow for research with children. We want to make sure that the procedures that we use are not going to be stressful for the children or cause psychological or physical harm. And a good example of that is the strange situation we mentioned earlier, where a child comes in with their mom and the mom leaves and a stranger comes in, and then the stranger leaves and the mom comes back. That was deemed as stressful, and so we don't do that kind of research anymore. A card sort was developed with the data that was gathered from the strange situation, and instead today parents sort those cards in least like their child would be one category, and most like their child would be a 5, and then there's a 2, 3, and 4 in between. Participants would be informed of the risks, benefits, and procedures that are part of that study, and parents have to give permission for their child to participate. And confidentiality, this provides protection of the participants' information and responses. And then lastly, we want to exercise caution in using deception, and we don't want to trick people. And then lastly, participants need to be debriefed following the study and told about the outcome. Okay, so those are the basic ideas, basics of child development, the basic concepts, and how we do research.